Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Papaya Reserve Natural Processed Ecuador from H&S Coffee Roasters. There's the bag right there. And H&S, based out of Laramie, Wyoming. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel quite a bit, including our recent review of the Kiamongi AB, a wash-processed Kenyan coffee. And in that review, I mentioned that there was a different catalyst for this H&S purchase, and that is, of course, this coffee right here, as my introduction to H&S was over a year ago now when I tried out the La Reserva, a different natural processed Ecuadorian Mejorado coffee. And unfortunately, I only got a sample of that coffee, so there was no review. And I say unfortunately because that was actually one of my favorite natural processed coffees that I tried from the entirety of 2024. So when I heard that this coffee was offering a lot of similarities to that one, it immediately caught my interest. So we'll see how it turned out, as this right here is day 67. And recipe we went with for this coffee was actually a lower extraction one, at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee, I actually went back and looked at the information for this coffee and missed that they recommended at least 45 days rest for this one, as they indicated that it's actually a little lighter than their ultralight profile actually does indicate. And they said that it could be even a little closer to their hyperlight profile, which explains so much given the experience that we did have from this coffee. So even though this one is listed as one of their ultralight offerings, it's actually a little bit lighter than an ultralight offering would indicate, though we've had coffees from them that have been lighter before, their hyperlight offerings, of course. But even then, this one skews on even the lighter side of that very light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 34, first impression, and as mentioned, I did not see that they suggested 45 days rest period for this one, so we opted for the V60, and it was holding its structure, offering an intense but relatively clean experience, as it's reminiscent of the Iris and Divino Nino in terms of the cereal grain presentation that's in line with the listed Fruit Loops. Outside of that, it's skewing in a mostly strong but even berry sense, as it was going to be interesting to see if this coffee was going to be able to maintain its structure based off of that initial impression. So the notes they have on here, what are they? Fruit Loops, I want to say violet, strawberry. I think those are the three notes that they have on here. And on this first impression, I was thinking to myself, yeah, it's got that very red, very purple, artificial, sugary grain feel to it, but I don't know how well it's going to hold up given that it was already pretty intense and was on the verge of not necessarily being overly clean. So on day 37, we opted for the Chemex, and there was a similar sentiment this time around, as there's a fair bit of a grainy intensity to it with an abundance of sugary berry qualities to it. It honestly felt like this coffee was probably going to need a fair bit of time to settle, as it's offering plenty of similarities to the more processed Mejorado coffees we've had as well. So it is worth noting, we did have that Divino Nino, which was a different natural processed Ecuadorian Mejorado coffee, and Iris was a more processed Panamanian Gesha coffee, but both of which were pretty similar in that very grainy, heavy berry sense to them. So this coffee was also offering plenty of those characteristics on this initial first couple of days. Day 40 through the UFO brewer, and there are more struggles with this coffee, as it still feels a little bit more fermenty and grain-like than expected. And given that experience I did have with the La Reserva last year, that coffee was very well rested. So by the time we received the sample, I want to say it was closer to the day 70, day 80 mark, and I was just thoroughly impressed by how clean it was, especially for it being a natural processed coffee. But this one continues to feel essentially like grape cereal with a very strong berry quality to it. It does improve as it cools, with a little bit of the graininess dissipating, but for the most part, it's just a very long-lasting artificial berry feel as of these first couple of days. Day 44 through the V60 with some higher extraction adjustments, and I was really concerned to see how this was going to turn out. So 17:1, 99 Celsius, and a more fine grind, and the coffee was surprisingly the best it had been to this point, as there was a little less of the graininess, allowing for a slightly cleaner experience. Better defined berry qualities to it, with just a slight bit of fermentiness, but an extremely high level of sweetness. Won't really come as a surprise to anybody, as this one, of course, being a natural processed Mejorado. Going into it, I fully expected level 5 for sweetness right from the onset, and this definitely delivered on that. Day 47 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, And the coffee is still maintaining a fair bit of clarity, given that it's not quite as heavy and fermenty as expected, but it's still pretty intense nonetheless, with a fair bit of that cereal grain quality to it, a sweeter artificial berry presentation, and just a very slight bit of Mejorado sugariness to it in the finish. So I did see glimpses of the varietal to this coffee, but we'll probably get into that a little later in this review. Day 50 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so 15-1 and 93 degrees Celsius. And there were pros and cons to this adjustment, as it definitely helped reduce some of the grainy qualities to it and fermentiness, but it did come at the cost of some of the sweetness, which, truth be told, there's enough sweetness to spare, so that's not necessarily the worst thing to lose. Otherwise, it's expectedly berry forward, as it has been throughout the entirety of this experience. Day 53 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee is perhaps just a little bit better, as there's a little less of the heaviness to it and a more clean presentation of the sweet Mejorado qualities in the finish. So again, I'm seeing glimpses of the Mejorado sugary characteristics to it, but even then, it's pretty dominated by the berry components in this one. Day 57 through the V60 with the lower extraction adjustments one more time, and it finally is starting to feel like this coffee has settled to the point where we were expecting, as it was by far the cleanest experience that I'd had up to this point, as there's a nice definition to the berry qualities to it, significantly less of the graininess, even traces of apricots to go alongside a very strong sugary Mejorado-like characteristic. So Day 57, I want to say, was the first glimpse of this coffee being much more in line with what I expected it to be. And here on this day 67 mark, I've seen even better results. So same thing as what we said with the Kamwangi AB. This coffee needed more time. We didn't give it enough time. So as a result, by the time that we finished brewing it on this day 57 mark, it was by far the best it had been. And in today's brew, it's even better than it was on that day. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have two level 5s, which won't come as a surprise to anybody whatsoever, as we have the sweetness and the berry fruit at a level 5. I want to check here real quick. Do I have the Divino Nino? I'm going to take a look at the Divino Nino tasting wheel while I'm here. Yeah, that had a finish at a level 5, but the sweetness and berry fruit were both at a level 5. I wonder if we have the iris on here too. Yeah, let's take a look at that. And the iris, we have the sweetness at a level 4. That's kind of interesting. Berry fruit level 5 though, a finish level 5, and the florality level 5. So different than those in that sense at least, but two level 5s nonetheless. Sweetness, berry fruit level 5. Not surprising whatsoever. And I mentioned that pretty early on I got a pretty good idea that this was going to be about as sweet as it gets. I mean, Mejorados in general tend to be extremely sweet. Couple that with a more processed version of them, and yes, you're going to have an almost overbearing sweetness to it, and that was the case with this one. I mean, it's just unbelievably sweet. So level 5 is where we scored it. It's one of those level 5s that could even be higher than that, so very, very sweet coffee. Not really surprised in that. Berry fruit level 5. Again, I think that the berry fruit they have listed on here is strawberry. For me, it reminds me a lot of just berry cereal. And given that there's that very strong cereal grain, it makes a lot of sense. Just a strong artificial sugary grain quality to it, especially in the earlier days. Now, it did have better definition towards the end, and I can see a more clean berry presentation to it. But I do have to say that for the majority of the time we were working on it, very high in that sense. All right, let's go through the level 4s. We will start with the finish level 4. It's not overbearing, and that's a really big thing to highlight in this tasting wheel, as the other ones, the Iris and the Divino Nino, were both overbearing. So this one was cleaner than that. It didn't have that overbearing, long-lasting, super intense finish to it, while this coffee is very intense and very sweet. Not to the same extent as either of those two coffees, so that's definitely a win. Acidity level 4, you know, when it comes to more processed Mejorado coffees, I continue to see them scoring there at that level 4 mark, as they have so much brightness to them in general that I could definitely give or take. So level 4, where we opted to put that. Florality level 4, and it's offering a very similar floral characteristic to what the Iris was. I don't think I ever specifically highlighted any floral qualities to it, but it's definitely a lot of those violets, and it's very intense in that sense too. Not to the same extent as the berry component, so we kept that a little lower at the level 4 mark, but even then, very intense within this coffee. Not surprising that that one scored as high as it did, though it probably could have scored even higher based on some, I don't want to say adjustments. Citrus fruit, we'll move on to the level 3s. We'll start with the citrus fruit level 3. I don't necessarily think I have anything worth highlighting in that regard. It just had a little bit of a slight citric characteristic to it. I mean, any of the additional qualities in this coffee are going to be very much buried underneath the very intense berry qualities of this one. Stone fruit level 3, I mentioned some slight traces of apricot, which was nice, giving this coffee a little bit more depth than just being super berry abundant, very forward. Caramel level 3, I mentioned there's a pretty strong sugary mejorado quality to it. I can see that slight brown candy characteristic, which could also be a component of the roasting machine on this one. So level 3, where we opted to put that. And then the two last things we're discussing, body level 3, actually had a fair bit more body and texture than I might have expected, a little bit more medium bodied to it in that regard. And then the final thing, definitely the most important thing we're discussing, cleanliness level 3. It is on the higher side of level 3. It's definitely cleaner than Divino Nino. It's definitely cleaner than Iris. And here on this day 67 mark, I could probably justify it being there at the level 4, but truth be told, especially given the majority of the time I was working with this coffee, it was too intense. It was too fermenty to justify a level 4. So level 3 is where I opted to put that. And outside of that, though, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This was basically confirmation bias on two things that I very much believe when it comes to everything that this coffee is. First of which being natural processed mejorado coffees. I don't think the processing is necessary for mejorados. They're already sweet and intense as they are, so when you add additional processing to it, it just makes the coffees way more sweet and intense than they need to be, which is often why I've never actually found myself enjoying a lot of the natural processed mejorado coffees, with the exception of La Reserva. But this one right here actually did show a lot of potential of being very enjoyable, especially from the last two times that we did try this coffee. I want to say 2 brews left of this coffee that I'm probably going to freeze and maybe try, I don't know, a month from now or so, and see if this coffee does improve from there, because I can definitely see it getting better. I can definitely see it getting cleaner. And that's the first takeaway that I did have from this coffee. But the second one being what I have when it comes to H&S, trust the process. Be very patient, because this coffee definitely has shown signs of significant improvement the longer we've let this coffee rest. So I do wonder what would have happened if we would have at least started at the day 45 mark, because from day 47 going forward, we had better experiences. Day 57 was pretty good. Day 67 is the best it's been. So going forward, I do imagine this coffee will just continue to improve. So a little bit of patience probably would have paid off significantly in the way that we did perceive this coffee, but we can only go based off the first, well, I want to say handful of experiences that we did have, which didn't necessarily indicate the cleanest experience, but the potential was more than there. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you have liked the very intense berry qualities of these types of coffees, so I'm highlighting specifically Divino Nino and Iris largely because those coffees were very similar to this one for the majority of the time that we were working on this coffee. That being said, I think that this one does have a higher ceiling than both of those, as it's been demonstrated in the final couple of experiences that we did have from this coffee, because it can present a little bit more clean of a berry quality to it. Still present a very sweet and intense sense, but not quite as overbearing as the either of those two coffees, with a little bit more additional depth to it. So it definitely could have been one of my favorites. I just feel like in the same way that I should have waited on the Kiamuangi AB to just start it a little later, I probably should have started this coffee a little later. And there are so many H&S reviews that I have felt that same sort of sentiment. So maybe going forward, we'll give them an additional, 2 weeks worth of rest or something. I think that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to hear your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if not already subscribed. This right here has been your review of the La Papaya Reserve, natural processed Ecuador from H&S Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.